Well, good morning. Come on in, have a seat. We'll get started this morning. Perfect time. There it is. Well, good morning. My name is Scott Filliman. I'll say maybe extended family. I don't know. My mother and father-in-law were here in our marriage. What was your name again? I've been invited to give a symposium, perhaps, of the history of instrumental music in New Testament worship. We started last week, but of course, me, who I am, I forgot the little cable that was allowed to see some of the things that I wanted you to see. So we're going to do a very brief recap before we go on. We can't take too much time and still get out before 2023. So we'll move a little quicker here. For those of you who weren't here last week, this will maybe be a little beneficial to you. It also gives a quick refresher before we get into the organ where we left off last week. Okay. I remember talking about flutes and a petrified harp and a cuneiform text. So these are them. The bone flute that's pictured here is the one that's found in modern-day Syria, or so dated to somewhere between 3,800 and 4,000 BC. Again, if you have to assume that modern-day practices are accurate. There's a lot of assumptions here. This harp is a petrified wooden harp that was found in Ur. If I remember my dates correctly, about 2750 BC. This would have been about 50 to 100 years before the flood. And of course, it's been restored. But the wood is original. This little tablet here, and it is little, you can see the fingers, right? This is cuneiform, is the language. That is to be considered the earliest uncontested form of poetry. This is written in meter. Some believe that this could be a song, but there's no indication of pitch. So we don't really know. We just think that it's possible that that's a song. We definitely know that it's in meter, though. These are the Delphic hymns, 128 BC. That's what I was talking about last week. You can see very faintly the solid lines of text, Greek letters there. That's the lyrics. In between the lines, you can see the symbols. Very recently, there was a codex that was discovered in and around Delphi that actually interpreted those, and we know now that that's actually pitch, and we know how this actually sounded. This is the earliest uncontested form of written music in our currently known world, dated to 128 BC. Okay, moving on. Very quick recap. Major part of this slide is that we have musical instruments in the archaeological record found in virtually every instruments of some kind have been found in every culture that we've ever discovered, mostly through artwork. It's rare that we have a physical artifact like we did from Ur, but they're there. We went into discussing what they were for, what they were used for. Generally speaking, what we can glean from documents that we can interpret is instruments were used primarily in that middle section there to heal sickness, to purify the body and mind, work miracles in nature. By the way, we were talking about the kithara. Jim had a fantastic comment. I looked it up, and that's exactly where that's from. Yeah, we'll get there in a second. Okay, these are maybe the summary points of these first few slides here. The surviving ancient metrical texts, heavily sacred, of course, to their cultural god, right? Okay, music in the Greco-Roman religion. We were talking about the lyre, kithara, and aulos are depicted very commonly in Plato's Republic. He discusses that learning the lyre should be required of all Greek students. And here they are. Lyre on the left, Kithara on the right. You can see how they're similar. And they are similar. The Kithara is the older brother, so to speak, of the lyre. Lyre is depicted here in pottery, something a little bit smaller than the Kithara. The lyre would have had 5 strings, maybe up to 7, but no more. The Kithara is, you can read about in the Old Testament of the instrument 10 strings, and you can kind of see why. The comment that Jim, actually, you told me something about it. What was this?
You had mentioned in your introduction last week that music was considered by the ancient cultures as being therapeutic, that had medicinal properties to it. And I was wondering if that's where we get the word cathartic, related medically to, making a person feel better, healthier, whatever. Is that where we got the word cathartic from the Cathara, the music?
We didn't get it from the Cathara. The word catharsis for purge, to cleanse, pre-existed or was around, is known to be a therapeutic process. The instrument Kithara was called that because of the therapeutic properties that it had. It's exactly right. So it was kind of one of those where the general thought, remember, this is almost too fast, but the general thought was that music had healing properties, catharsis, and so we were going to create an instrument named after that. And so the instrument will create healing properties because we say that it does. something like that. Government at its best. Okay, we have the olives. This is what it pictured on pottery. Again, the pottery selections that I have are all dated within 200 years BC, from 200 BC to 0. So we have kind of an idea of what this might look like. This is a reconstruction of that instrument. This was done mid 2000s, and we know everything about the olives except for the actual reed itself. And so we're going to make some assumptions on how this instrument actually was created in terms of sound. Very cool instrument. Twin pipes, you play both of them. One is kind of like a drone, if you're familiar with like a bagpipe kind of idea. It has like a drone that moves, and you do the other one will manipulate pitch on top of that. Okay. Access to instrumental music. This is these next few slides here are what I personally find kind of mind-blowing. The access to instrumental music. We almost have the idea that instrumental music was the subset, like this underground culture in the first century or even before, where people just didn't have access to it. And that's just simply not true. Instrumental music was around. It was prolific all over the place. This is a theater at Corinth. 14,000 seats. That's big. That's really big. Put it into a different angle. If you were to stand at the top center looking down, this is what you'd see. So real quick, looking at the bottom platform, the stage, if you will, this wasn't a place where we had enormous gladiator fights. This wasn't a place where we went to go watch the basketball game. What happened? What took place in these kinds of theaters? Like these were the forums that Paul would go to preach, to talk to those people. If he wasn't in a synagogue, this is where he would do it. This is in terms of secular entertainment. This is where theater would go on. You can see there's ruins to the right. There's pillars and columns and whatnot. Best archaeological record would suggest that there would be like essentially an entire backstage where you would have actors come out in costume and you'd have props and such. Theater. What accompanied what's a good villain without a good soundtrack behind him, right? You'd have instrumentalists and to accompany the play. Solo contests by instrumentalists were fairly common at this time. This is Ephesus. You can't even get the whole theater in the same frame, right? It's huge. Theater at Ephesus. In fact, in order to get the theater in the same frame, you have to be this far away from it. 24,000 seats. And you can see the market below. The market there with those vertical columns sitting up. This is the market of the forum. This is like shops would be around. You're off to the side, I believe if I have my geography correct, is off to the left. There's a field out there that is called the gymnasium where athletic events would take place. So I want you to get that around your head right now. We have this theater, and then we have a field where athletic events would take place, down and away, not in the stadium, so to speak. So what was the stadium used for? Athletic crowning ceremony? Sure. Theater? Absolutely. Music performance? Definitely. Political debate? 100%. We can't look at this and be like, oh wow, they played pickleball over here. No, I mean that was a different place. Okay, athletics were important, but they weren't nearly of the same level of importance as our society is here today in 2022. They used these forums for the pursuit of the humanities. That's pretty undisputed. Okay, I'm sure you've seen this one. Some call it the Colosseum, Flavian Amphitheater, has many names, but the Roman Colosseum, this is what it is from an aerial view.
Our daughter has been there. She saw this.
That's very cool. Someday. We're all familiar with this one, I think. Look at the number of seats. 18,200. This is the Paycom Center is really interesting. We're running basketball, hockey, you can configure the seats, the configurations inside. I didn't know that. The least amount of seats that it can hold is about like 11,000. But 18,203 is the max capacity. That's assuming that you fill all of the boxes up. You can cram the maximum number of seats inside. Everything. 18,203 max capacity. Guys, this is a metropolitan area of roughly 1 million people. 18,000 is our major arena. Ephesus had 24,000. These were significant places. Okay, this is what I found interesting. This is, on the left, you have the Paycom Center. On the right, you have the Roman Colosseum, and this is to the same scale. 50,000, 18,000. That's almost a whole city block for that arena. This is the theater at Ephesus. It's like taking the entire Paycom grounds, leveling it, and putting nothing in but stadium seating. No shops, no hot dog stands. Okay. These were enormous places. Enormous places. Did the first century Christians have access to instrumental music? Absolutely, 100%. In major places where the church was, Corinth and Ephesus, these were significant places, and they had access to it. So why do we care? Bottom 3 points there: instrumental music and the Greco-Roman culture didn't simply exist. It was part of their daily life, and learning to play an instrument was just expected as part of social standing. Okay, that's essentially the recap from last week. There's a few other things that we went through, and I'll blaze through this. Music from the Greco-Roman culture versus Jewish Christian culture was very, very different. Just a couple of references here and there. This is going into Philo. Okay, when was instrumental music introduced? We talked about the organ. And this is essentially where we left off. We'll give the obligatory like the 10-second intro here. Pope Vitalian I is credited with the introduction of the organ in 666 AD. And it wasn't really around until the 10th century, about 900 is really when it's, I'll say, widely accepted by modern day historians that it was introduced, about 900, okay? The 12th century, about 1100 is really more likely. The Catholic Encyclopedia actually gives some examples of where the organ was actually in use between 1000 and 1100 AD. So that is when we really know that it was in existence. We can speculate before then, but 1100 is really about it. By 1220, 1230 or so, it was in general use, but not in the way that you might think of it. This is a drawing of the first organ. Roman inventor Sevius, about 250 BC, he invented what we would call today hydraulics. But in his process of creating essentially a water pressure powered windmill, if you will, essentially he accidentally created the organ, forgot the water. It was a water-based unit, and it created this pressure with air. Had essentially, if you wanted to do a cross section of this pedestal here, you would see air in here, you have water in here. As the water pumps, air pressure increases, out comes the air through these reeded pipes, and it creates music, or at least sound anyway. Little tangent here. This is a reconstruction of the Hydraulus that he would have created for about 1st century BC. This is the oldest surviving Hydraulus that we know of. It's in Dion, Greece at the moment. You can kind of see there's some glass pipes in there, right? I think we may have had to have been a bit of a stretch to assume that these pipes are that tall. But it's not a great picture, but it is the only one that exists. Down here, you can't see it in this projection here, but this is the top of the pedestal, and kind of see some things. The Talmud, I mentioned that last week. The Talmud is really the only document that we have that describes what the first 200 years of Jewish musical practices were. It is dated about 200 AD, and it is very, very detailed. And the Talmud is really explicit on the hydraulis. In fact, it says, quote, not appropriate for worship. That's interesting. This is the only document, really, that's authoritative to describe what the first 200 years were of, shall we say, Christian worship. And it rejects using not just this instrument, but any instrument. Why? Hydraulus appears in mosaics throughout antiquity. It's around all over the place. It really is. Long into the medieval time period and beyond in the Renaissance. There's a 9th century treatise in the Byzantine Empire that discusses it. If you're really interested in how it works, it's there. References to a musical tree, 900 AD, thereabouts, is all over the place. We know how this thing worked. We know what it was used for. And you can see this mosaic here in Libya. It was a Roman province, okay? In a little bit, we're going to zoom out and see the full mosaic. I'm going to give you just a second to kind of take a look at this. Any art historians here? What does a mosaic tell us? A story. These are not individual snapshots. This is a continuous story. So if we start at the top, what do we have? We've got some musicians that are playing. Look at the second line. What do we have? We have gladiators. Look at the third. What do we have? Yeah, look a little closer. This guy's tied onto a chariot, being pushed out, getting munched by a lion. to the sounds of the organ. This was not in a coliseum. This was not found in a place of athletic contest. This was found in the floor of a worship place. I can't say church because that's not accurate, or temple. It was a place of worship for the Greco-Roman Empire. This was found on the floor of that building. This was really common. All of that was really common. It's interesting that the musicians were placed at the top, a place of prominence, because they were playing as entertainment for the rest of the story. We don't know who these people were. We have no idea if these were like the feeding Christians to the lions. We have no idea what this particular story was about. But what we do know and what we conclude is we are using these instruments, particularly the hydraulus, for entertainment purposes in a place of Roman worship. So I don't think it's really that far of a stretch to understand why early church leaders didn't want to use the hydraulus in worship services, even despite the access they had to it, right? Just looking at strictly from a historical standpoint. Okay, the organ moving forward for the Renaissance, 1400 to 1600, the water organ or the hydraulus. It kind of developed this sense of magic around it. Something that was a little bit more, I don't want to say like arcane, because that's not what we're talking about. It's talking about something that was a little bit more, a sense of wonder, a sense of like, wow, that's something neat. We don't really have that sense of wonder in today. We can explain things away very quickly, but this was like a sense of awe was around it, and not in terms of like, wow, that thing is so amazing. It was just, wow, that's something unique. And it was so unique that people put them in their gardens as an ornament, kind of like our yard gnomes are today, right? They would create. It became almost a center of craftsmanship. We have carpenters who, well, maybe we don't have carpenters today. We can put decorative scroll work on the end of the banister rail, or we can have little flourishes, filigree all around our craft. That's what they did with these organs. It became a piece of craftsmanship more than it was an actual instrument to use. And so they would display these almost like a status symbol. Think of like a fountain, like a water fountain in front of a yard. You have like a little fountain compared to this really large and elaborate fountain. It's kind of like a status symbol, kind of like a decoration. That's what these were ultimately used for throughout the Renaissance. You can read here little dancing figures, wing flapping birds. There was one that had it was a cyclops with a hammer coming down, and it would do like this. It still works. Anyway, by the 1700s, the hydraulus was essentially out of vogue and in favor of the air organ, or the pump organ, as it was called in the medieval time period. We had essentially bellows for the power, and that was the organ that was accepted, and that's the pipe organ we know today. That is described at life in the 10th century. There was a monk who dedicated his life to documenting the organ in the 10th century, and the development over time between the hydraulus and the pump organ. So we know a lot about it. The original pump organ was so large, it took some 110 monks just to operate it. There's a joke there. How many monks is it anyway? So there's a little bit about the organ. I'll kind of stop there because there's a lot to be said out there. My master's thesis was on how the social status of medieval monks increased and along with the development of organ over the medieval time period. If you're having trouble sleeping at night, I'll let you read it. Other musical instruments, we want to go backwards back to the first century. We know about the organ, but what about other things? We had the lute, the lyre, the aulos were really common. We are kind of speculating a little bit when we say that the lute, lyre, and Hydraulus were also in practice, in use, common use as late as the 5th century AD. We know that they were around as early as the 3rd century AD, but we don't know exactly to what extent. So these are the instruments, of course, that these were associated with other cults by this time. I'm not in the 3rd and 5th century AD, I mean like back to the 1st century, where the lyre was associated with the cult of Apollo. It was a symbol of that cult. We also know that the Hydraulus was a symbol of the cult of Dionysus, the god of wine. So these instruments were really closely associated with Greek and Roman gods, and so they weren't really used for Jewish or Christian worship. The pipe or the flute, the tabret or cymbals, the harp, these were really closely associated with what we would call heathen cults, pagan worship. The pipe and the tabret were actually so closely associated with revelry that they were actually banned from Greek worship. I don't know how bad you have to get banned from Greek worship, but it must have been pretty bad. Okay, Clement of Alexander, this guy, 200 AD, he has 2 quotes associated with him. And I bring this up because the question that we're exploring at the moment is, remember, when did instruments become accepted into New Testament worship? Okay? First quote, and even if you wish to sing and play to the harp or lyre, there is no blame. We know that he said that. We have no idea what the context was, but if you read documents that are pro-instrumental music, they bring this up, that he said this. And so it is clearly, I say this tongue-in-cheek, this is clearly an approval to use the harp and the lyre in worship because we're singing, and there's no blame. And he is, this big guy, he's Clement of Alexander, he's the emperor. If you zoom back now and you read the document, he's actually talking about theater. Interesting. But we don't know to what extent. We know that religious drama occurs. That's part of the fuzzy argument here. What we know is that it's not explicitly worship. Look at the second quote. The one instrument of peace, the word, capitalized, interestingly enough, alone by which we honor God is what we employ. We no longer employ the ancient psaltery and trumpet and timbrel and flute, for the tongue is the psaltery of the Lord. That's another direct quote from Clement of Alexander. And we have a source for that one. I'm just going to let that sit. I don't think that needs any commentary. When were musical instruments put into worship and why? We know 100% that it wasn't within at least the first 200 years, with Clement of Alexander being the strongest argument to suggest its introduction before the 7th century with the Pope. That's the strongest evidence. And even then, we have a direct quote from him saying that the tongue is the psaltery to the Lord. Okay? From the perspective of musical practice or music theory, harmony was unknown until about 1000 AD. The idea of multiple parts in harmony didn't exist until about 1000 AD. Therefore, chord progressions were unknown. And in fact, chord progressions are one of the defining characteristics of between the Renaissance and the Baroque time period in music history. Renaissance ended, talking about music history, Renaissance ended at 1600 and the Baroque began at 1600. The advent of chord progressions was one of the defining characteristics between those two epochs in music history. 1600 years after this occurred, okay? So what does that mean? If you don't have harmony, and if you don't have chord progressions, what do you have? You have chant. You have lyrics. You have rhythm, right? Quick shout out from last week. Greek music, we know is metrical. Pagan music, we know is metrical. If you wanted to get away from all things pagan, you got away from all things metrical. You wouldn't want to use instruments because it was not only associated with pagan music, but it created the same rhythm and pulse as you would have with pagan music. Alrighty, there would be a crossover between secular and sacred forms of music, and you wanted to have that separated so that there would be a clear delineation between the two. Instrumental music before 1000 AD existed as accompaniment to vocal music. That is to say that instrumentalists, as a solo artist, did not exist. There's actually no archaeological evidence to support that they did, that you had a solo instrumentalist before about 1000 AD, really closer to about 900. Because this is the idea that you're strumming your harp, you're strumming your lyre, your guitar, and you would accompany a vocalist. The allos would be a drone, and it would create this aura of sound for an epic poem to be recited. You were the background music to another event. You were not a solo artist, didn't exist. Instruments were used to keep time, we've been over that. Here are the major 6 points from the last 2 weeks. Records of music have been found in every culture. Instruments were not used in Jewish synagogues in the first century. We talked a little bit about that, temple worship versus synagogue. Instruments were taught as part of a valid education, and no record exists from any culture. I think that's really important. No record exists from any culture that suggests that instruments were used in Jewish or Christian worship for at least the first 300 years. Not even the people that disliked, loathed entirely the Jewish culture said that they worshiped. They were like, yeah, they just sing only. They're a cappella. We'll talk about a cappella a bit. Charlemagne was the first person in historical record to suggest using the organ. About 800 AD, didn't really get into use until about 900. The overwhelming focus of early Christian writers was to emphasize spiritual worship and not physical expression. What questions do you have? What can I answer for you right now? And I'm talking strictly about the historical perspective of instrumental music. Anything you want to know? We'll get into doctrine, and we'll actually get into Bible here in a second. We should do that in the Bible class. Yes, sir.
The progression of the word solo.
We'll get there.
Also, progression of the word lyre.
I don't know that one.
Lyric.
Lyric.
Lyre, lyric.
That makes sense.
That's it.
Yeah, I didn't know about lyre. I should. But solo word definitely is. Sorry. Yeah.
I know this doesn't directly apply, I guess, to us in the church, but thinking about going up to the first century with Jewish worship, was there a time where, thinking about the Psalms and David doing poems or music with a harp, was there a time before the first couple hundred years BC where instruments were more heavy in Jewish worship and then that faded away? I think you kind of touched on that, but I wasn't remembering that.
Yes. Okay, so we have references all over the Old Testament where it uses illustrative word practice. Right?
Yeah, I want to interrupt because I guess what was in my head was that something that individuals were doing, or is that attached to worship? Because that's what I meant to say when I brought up David. Like, we knew that he did that, but was that a worship thing, or was that just something that people did at other places?
It's a great question. So the short answer is yes, and also no. But as best as we can tell, the using musical instruments in Old Testament worship practices were common, provided that they were also being used by a certain tribe. Levites. And so that's essentially a boundary that we can reasonably determine, both in biblical text and also archaeology. What we also know, by the time the first century came around, there was a widespread ban on musical instruments in all synagogues. It was exclusively used in the temple in Jerusalem, and that was the only place that it was used, because that was the only place where the Levites existed. Okay? Levites were authorized to use instrumental music within the temple, but they were not in the area of the synagogues, so we didn't have instruments in synagogues, it was only in Jerusalem temple. The other side, of course, we have, is it scripture, is it policy, creed, we don't know. How was this developed? What was this? There was a ban on instruments to be performed on the Sabbath. If you were a Jew living within the first 100 years, BC to 0, we know that there was a ban that existed on instrumental music exclusively on the Sabbath. It could be used in other things, but not worship. On the Sabbath, only in temple. That's pretty clear. It was reinforced on a few different occasions. So I suppose to answer the question more concisely, yes, instruments were used in temple worship in Jerusalem, and not really anywhere else. Part of it was also to remember what those instruments represented in the time period of the culture of the time. What else? Yes.
We're doing a study for Monday nights. We're going over a lot of the ante-Nicene fathers, and you mentioned Clement of Rome, but understand it's been several weeks ago, but like Ambrose and Basil, Polycarp, some of those guys were adamantly opposed also to instrument, citing a lot of things going on with that used in pagan worship. You have, I mean, is that consistent with your research? Or
Yes. Yeah, I bring up Clement because he has one of the clearest quotes on what the general consensus was in the day. When you saw the quote there about the tongue is solving the heart, that was not revolutionary. That was a common thought. And Ambrose is widespread that instruments were a pagan instruments, were a Greek instruments, were a Roman part of their worship. It was not part of Jewish culture. It was not part of what we related to Christian worship. Just simply not there. And it was widespread. As I mentioned before, there's no culture of any age of any time that even remotely suggests that instruments were used in Jewish worship practices. In fact, just the opposite. The word acapella comes out of that. They had to come up with a new word to define Jewish musical practice. And ultimately, it is turned into what we know as acapella, or vocal only. Reverse that back from the chapel, from the church, and then we back there from the voice. Is what that word has come to be. Yes?
Do you address expedience?
Expedience?
Yeah,
Not-
expediency.
Not here, I don't. What's your comment?
Well, it's argued that expedients are not an addition to the Word of God. An expedient is a way to accomplish the Word of God. But those that want musical instruments say they are expedients as well, but they're not really because they don't expedite the interaction of the mind, they expedite the interaction of the flesh, the sensory organs, the senses, not what is for edification.
Absolutely. In fact, to that point, yes, I do address it. Just not using that word, but yeah, I think this is a great segue to move on here. Okay. We'll move forward. All right. Next section, denominational leaders. This is getting into where we will be really in depth next week. Okay. We'll go through this slide here. Martin Luther. He nailed his 95 theses onto the wall. Remember this? Or onto the door. One of his theses was, I identify the organ as an instrument of Baal. That's pretty bold, okay? John Calvin, he has written, quote, these are all direct quotes, by the way, quote, musical instruments in celebrating the praise of God would be no more suitable than the burning of incense, the lighting of lamps, the restoration of other shadows of the law. John Wesley, I have no objection to instruments of music in our chapels, provided they are neither seen nor heard. Can you imagine sitting at his foot? You know, like, man. Adam Clark. Adam Clark. I am an old man and an old minister, and I here declare that I never knew musical instruments productive of any good in the worship of God, and have had reason to believe that they were productive of much evil. Music as a science I esteem and admire, but instruments of music in the house of God I abominate and abhor. This is the abuse of music, and I here register my protest against all such corruptions in the worship of the author of Christianity. William Conybeare and John Housen. I was going to say there should be a second one in there. Okay. They made a commentary, a commentary of Ephesians 5:19, sing and make melody. Make melody with the music of your heart of the Lord. Let your songs be not the drinking of heathen feasts, but psalms and hymns, and their accompaniment not the music of the lyre, but the melody of the heart. J.W. McGarvey. It is manifest that we cannot adopt the practice, that is instrumental music, without abandoning the obvious and only good ground on which a restoration of primitive Christianity can be accomplished. And Charles Spurgeon. I don't have a quote for him. Maybe a better way to put this is, I don't know if you know this about him or not, but he preached weekly to a crowd of thousands of people for nearly 20 years. And he had quite a bit of pressure to include the pipe organ specifically in his services, and he would not allow it. It was at the Metropolitan Baptist Tabernacle in London, and they had one of the largest, at the time, one of the largest and most ornate pipe organs known in the world, and he refused to use it associated with his worship services. Look at the dates on these. We've talked about widespread objection in the first 200 years. The organ itself wasn't even part of the Roman Catholic Church until 900 to 1100 AD at the very best. And even then, it was a signal to start organ classes or worship. It was a way to communicate with the masses that, hey, we're about to worship here. Come to us, and then we don't use this instrument. We talked about an organ being heard up to 60 miles away last week. In 2015, there was a pipe organ that was reconstructed from 1264, I believe. And they tested it, they wanted to know how loud this thing could get, and they got up to 138 decibels. Guys, a jackhammer is 104, a gunshot is 140. Okay, like a jet engine is like 120 decibels. This is 138 decibel pipe organ. So, I mean, if you're in the mountains, valleys, you could probably very easily hear this thing 60 miles away when there's no other structures. It was used as a signaling device. It was used to bring people in. It wasn't used in worship until almost the 1500s. I want to say 1520 something. I could be wrong about that, but it was 1500s. Next week we're going to go a little deeper into Scripture. We're going to talk about Psalms. We're going to look at what the Scriptures say about worship. Final comments.
No, you didn't make any comment about the Orthodox churches, that they never, still do not use instrumental music.
I will. That gets fun. Yeah. There's a real quick side comment. There's a papal decree in 2017 that the organ is still not permitted in the Catholic Church. Yeah.
Do the Orthodox churches, Greek Orthodox, or Russian Orthodox, do they use musical instruments?
Their primary instrument of choice are actually bells. The Russian Orthodox Church uses handcrafted bells, like wood. That's their primary instrument of choice. There's a whole different development of bells in the Russian Orthodox.
When they split off, were they the Eastern and the Western? Were they still against musical instruments, unlike the
Eastern Orthodox promoted instruments for the most part. The Western Orthodox still follow conventional as far as what they're generally used for. Eastern Orthodox kind of follow the Byzantine line of thinking, where instruments were generally part of praise and celebration. But yeah, their instrument of choice were actually bells. It was an effort to separate themselves from the pipe organ, but it was still an instrument. Final thoughts?
Just a funny thing, in a church in Minnesota, a Lutheran church in Minnesota, they had a special celebration where they had all these new bells, ringing of the bells, and the preacher just loud praise on it. And he said that the Bible talks about the noisy gong and clanging cymbals. He quoted that verse.
So you probably got 2 more off
I'm wondering, I know that Martin Luther was trying to reform the Roman Catholic Church. These other gentlemen on the list, did they ever leave that denomination over this issue?
Did they leave the denomination or the issue of the denomination?
Right, like Charles Spurgeon, the Baptist preacher, did he say, look, I'm getting out of this because this is just wrong?
I have no research on that. I don't think I took any notes about that'd be an interesting thing to explore. I really don't know.
He had a large Baptist church, and I don't think they used musical instruments because of his influence.
Most, it's hard to say most, because right now, like John Wesley, the Methodist Church widely uses musical instruments.
I'm in Spurgeon.
But Spurgeon, I don't know specifically about that. It'd be an interesting thing to find out. It's kind of more of a tangent than the direction we're going here. But next week, we're going to talk about scriptural authority. We're going to get into Solo and Solomos and Greek semantics. And we're going to then explore what does that mean for today. And then the final thing we're going to talk about, probably 2, maybe 3 weeks from now, is why would God want us to sing at all? And we're going to explore that at length. All right, thank you so much. Yeah.
That is such an interesting thing, isn't it, that God wants us singing. I mean, his people are singers. It's just such an amazing thing.
Yeah.